We talk a lot about getting the deal to write your first book, but what about rewriting that first book more than a decade later? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Kate Leahy, and today Molly Stevens and I are going to talk a little bit about what goes into creating a second edition. Hey, Molly.
Hi, Kate.
Can you imagine what it would be like to revisit something that you wrote years ago and, re-release it to the world?
I have thought about this a lot because my braising book is about 20 years old, and I sometimes think about what it would take. And I find it a little overwhelming. I mean, where would you even start?
That's a really good point, Molly, because where do you start is, do you redo all the recipes? Do you, right. I mean, if I were looking at A16, which came out in 2008, there would be ingredients that are so much easier to find now that I would probably change the way we talk about certain ingredients, but I'd also want to simplify the method. There were certain things that was really fussy about how to slice chard,
Absolutely.
What to do with chard stems. I was very fussy about that, and I just thought that was the way. But now when I work at home, I just cut through the whole chard stems and everything.
But there's also, if the book's out of print, I think that's a different thing. First of all, you're probably not going to get the chance to redo it if it's out of print, or maybe not. Maybe. I mean, sometimes that happens. Books get resurrected. But if a book is still in print and you have a chance to do a second edition, I feel like you want to still honor that first. So I wouldn't want to take it down to the bone. It's like, how do you refresh it and update it without gutting it? I don't know. I haven't done it, so that's why I'm really interested.
I haven't done it, and that's actually what I'm really looking forward to in this conversation with our guest today. Lukas Volger is the author of 5 cookbooks, 6 if you count the second edition of his book, Veggie Burgers Every Which Way, which we'll be talking to him a lot about today. But he also has done so many other things. Like he's written books that are really focused on putting vegetables at the center of your meal, and in really creative ways. Like he's written Bold. You've probably seen that book where it's making meals very simple, but also filled with healthy ingredients. So, one of the books starts simple. He's written Snacks for Dinner, and he's also has a lovely Substack called Family Friend. But a couple of years ago, he was asked by his publisher, who published Veggie Burgers 13 years ago, and asked if he would consider doing a second edition. And since both of us have no idea what it takes to go into a second edition, he's the perfect person to have on the show. So with no further ado, let's welcome him on. Hi, Lukas. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very excited to be here. I love this podcast.
Well, thank you. We can't wait to dig into Veggie Burgers Every Which Way and hear about what it's like to sort of revisit work that you did, more than a decade ago, and what it's like to sort of re-release it in a second edition. But before we get into this book, I thought we'd just go back a little bit and hear about your cookbook author origin story. Take us back to, before you had your first book deal. How did you get your start?
Yeah, I feel like every time I tell this story, I feel like people are like, what? How did that happen? You're so lucky. And I got very lucky. But I worked, I've always been drawn to food. I've always made some of my favorite memories growing up are flipping through cookbooks with my mom and food magazines. And I worked at a bakery in Boise, Idaho, where I grew up during summers in high school. And then after I moved to New York, I worked as a prep cook and a baker and occasional line cook at a restaurant on the Upper East Side. And I just really loved those jobs. I loved the repetition, the scale, just the sort of camaraderie, the fact that it was just such a specific environment, and it really clicked for me. But after doing that for, in the time that I was doing that, I was also going to college at Hunter in the city. And I kind of became aware that the conditions aren't super great. The pay isn't super great. The hours aren't great. I don't know if this is actually something that I can make a career out of. And so I studied literature, and I ended up working in book publishing. During that time, I was still cooking a lot and doing the occasional odd job, cooking for a party or doing some little professional or personal chefy type things. After 8 or 9 years in publishing, I was sort of weaning myself out, and I was waiting tables again, and I was doing a little bit of like very, very small scale catering. And a friend of mine was starting his own publishing company, Matthew Lohr, who created The Experiment.
Right.
And I was having dinner with him one night, and he said to me, do you know anybody who could write a veggie burger cookbook? He was putting together his very first list. And he had worked in publishing. He used to work for Marlowe and Company, which was an imprint at Avalon. And he was putting together his first list, and I was like, at the time I was doing some online writing on Blogspot and Tumblr, and I was sort of like aware of this new sort of class of food writers online. And I was like, oh, I'll think about that. And then I started thinking about it, and I was like, I feel like I could do this. So, and I'd been making veggie burgers, and I'd become a vegetarian when I was in college, and so I was very familiar with like this area of food. So I just put together a proposal. I was like, I know you're asking me if I knew anybody, but I just want to like throw this into the ring. Here's what comes to mind for me if I was going to write a book like this. And he liked it, and that was that. I think the funny thing to me is that because I had worked in publishing and I had just seen so many books come and go, and I sort of started out like with very, very realistic expectations of what could happen to a book, that I was like, oh, well, that was fun. And then now I have to figure out what I'm going to do. And it ended up connecting, and sort of ended up being very timely. And I still, been hearing from people about this book for, the past 13 years. And so, at some point I was like, wow, I wonder if I'll get to like write another cookbook. That would be so cool if I could like do this again. And I ended up being able to do that. And now I've written, 5 cookbooks, and so
yes, and 6 with this one, if you count this as a re-edition. But it's so interesting, your background. So you were in publishing, you were working in food, so it made sense in a way, but you hadn't really connected the dots. It was the conversation with Matthew. But did you have a cookbook collection? Were you a cookbook
for sure
consumer?
I remember getting the Dina DeLuca cookbook right after I bought it from the Strand, like a used copy, and I would read that on the subway. So I've always it didn't occur to me that I could like write one until that sort of opportunity presented itself. But I'd always really loved them. And I loved, I didn't get to work in editing cookbooks, but at the publishing houses where I worked, those were always the ones I was drawn to when you could snatch one for free.
Yeah. Yeah. And you had a writing background. I mean, studying literature, clearly you've written quite a few papers, essays. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And it seems like that burger book really, I mean, I'm glad you pointed out that you had become a vegetarian, or you were a vegetarian when you wrote the book, but it seems like that really was the start of something for you, not just your cookbook career, but you started this business, the Made by Lukas. You had was it retail, wholesale, that veggie burger?
Yes, 2000. So that first book came out in 2010, and then I launched a veggie burger business called Made by Lukas in around 2014. It started very organically and small. Sort of the genesis of that was that at the beginning of this book, when I started working on the veggie burger cookbook, I went to the grocery store and bought all the frozen veggie burgers just to get a sense of what was out there. And then I went to work developing all my recipes and sort of coming up with my perspective on this. And then at the end, I went back and was like, okay, let's just go see what these taste like again after I've sort of gone through this journey. At the end, I was like, wow, there's a real difference between a homemade veggie burger. And, I knew this, but then it was so stark in that moment. And so in the back of my mind, I was like, seems like there's really an opportunity to do something different in this grocery space. The Made by Lukas product that I developed was different in a number of ways. One of which is that it was sold fresh rather than frozen. And then it was in a tub. Okay. So it was like a veggie burger mix made. Also, another thing that was different about it is primarily vegetables. 80% of it was vegetables that we sourced upstate in sort of the Hudson Valley area. And so you could scoop it into patties or scoop it into little balls or just treat it like meat rather than a sort of convenience food.
Yeah. You talk about that in your book too, how the mix you could make it into, and Kate, you and I were talking about this the other day. We were thinking, oh, these would make really good meatballs, but veggie balls.
Right.
For an
Instead of
appetizer,
falafel, you could just do these and bake them and then have them, on sort of a meze platter or anything like that. It's just so versatile in a way that I just never thought veggie burgers could be. So I thought that was really fascinating. But I'm also thinking That's got to be incredibly difficult to do retail, like do a fresh product retail. And I'm thinking, I mean, you must have like it made almost because we know how hard books are to create, but I'm thinking that's probably next level. You feel after doing that, you can do anything.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I always say and that seems to resonate with everybody I know who's started a food business is that you go into it not because you love food, but because you love business. And I went into it from this passion for veggie burgers and this sort of like wanting to sort of build on that and do something I thought would be better. But if I went into it based on a passion for like logistics and raising money, and I think the business would have probably been more successful. But I mean, it was still quite successful. We got distributed throughout the Northeast, Whole Foods, and a number of other grocery store chains and things. But it was really, really difficult. You're right. It's the fresh product made it hard. At the time, it was also a very unfamiliar product, and I see now that if you're going to go into a grocery store setting with a product that people aren't familiar with, you really need to set aside a lot of money for education. And so it's spending time in the grocery stores and coming up with all kinds of other initiatives to sort of help people understand how they should be using it and approaching it and thinking about it. And I did as much as I could, but I certainly I didn't raise a bunch of capital for that because it was as bootstrapped as they get.
And you decided that after that experiment, writing and creating recipes was more the work you'd like to keep doing instead?
Yes. And that I think one of the things that really motivates me in terms of recipe development is I just want people to cook. I feel like I know so many people that like they're sort of overwhelmed by the idea of cooking, or they think they don't, have enough skills, or they don't have time. And I just feel like a homemade meal, like 999 out of 1,000 times is going to be healthier, more affordable, more satisfying. And there's all these other reasons to do it. And so I just feel like in order to align myself to that mission, I think the cookbooks are probably a better thing to double down on.
Yeah.
Can I go back to just your first book was, I guess, on the first list, the first books created by the experiment. Tell us a little bit about the experiment, because I think it's a really unique sort of angle in publishing that some of the audience members of Everything Cookbooks might not be as familiar with.
Yeah, I think I might have been on like the second or the third list, but very early on. So the experiment was created by Matthew Lohr, who had worked in book publishing for a long time, sort of in like the wellness space. He's a very, very interesting editor and would probably be a great person for you guys to talk to, because he was really, really early in using sort of like what was happening online as to predict sort of like trends in the food space. And so he was the first to sign up Isa Chandra Moskowitz, the Vegan with a Vengeance cookbook. And he has published a lot of special diets books, and especially in the vegan category, the gluten-free category.
Gluten-free.
He
really
published the Forks Over Knives cookbook originally, and that went on to, has been republished in many different iterations by bigger houses since then. But his editions continues to sell and thrive, and so I think part of his skill is just like having a knack for like, I don't know. I kind of think of it almost like SEO publishing, where it's like niche. He knows that there's a subject that people are going to be searching for, and like having the book that is like the answer to the question. I feel like that cheapens what he does a little bit, but it's very smart in terms of how he builds his lists. And yeah, and I've learned so much through his publishing lists because. I think, I don't know, I've written a number of cookbooks, and like the more general mine are, seems like the worse they do, and the more specific they are, the better they are. And so whenever I help people and consult with their proposals, I'm like, you need to really dial in on like, what is it? What are you offering here? It's like, if you are a household name, that's one thing, but most of us aren't. And so if you can't sell it just on your platform, you need to really be able to like answer the question of like, what is this thing that I'm doing that nobody else is doing? Or what's the subject? What's my field of expertise? What are people going to be looking for when they find my book.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's really good advice. It's really good advice. Is the experiment New York based? I'm assuming it is.
Yes.
Yeah. So interesting.
That really makes a sense, because when I think of, say, Veggie Burgers was your first book, and it really resonated, and it resonated so much that, now here we're talking about it again 13 years after it was originally published, right? That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because there's a lot of books 13 years. The book I first was part of creating was A16 and came out in 2008. It's out of print now.
Wow, really?
I just found out.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I just found out. So, it's not a guarantee that books have as long of a life as you want for them. So, I thought it would be kind of neat to just talk a little bit about, how did this idea come for a second edition?
They reached out to me and said, I've put Veggie Burger. There's always like a little Veggie Burger, like Easter egg in all of my cookbooks. And they've seen and Matthew wrote to me and he said, I feel like you're not necessarily exhausted by this topic yet. So wondering what you would think about.
So wait, I just want to stop you there. By Veggie Burger Easter egg, because that's a phrase I never thought I'd hear, but I love it. But I'm looking at Start Simple, for example, Lucas, and I was just looking at I think it's a bean and carrot. Anyway, there's a veggie burger in there, and in your vegetarian entree book. So clearly you've got a love for veggie burgers.
And I did like a deconstructed veggie burger bowl in my bowl cookbook.
In the bowl book. Okay. So that's why Matthew's like, hey, you're still writing and talking about veggie burgers.
Exactly.
So.
I hadn't thought about it at that point when he reached out, but he'd sort of been aware of this. When the book came out, I think Veggie Burgers felt a little bit more fringe, and the cookbook was a way, a lot of people just weren't thinking about needing 30 different recipes for veggie burgers. If they had one, it was kind of like their go-to recipe, and otherwise it was really just like a convenience food. And then over the past decade, I feel like veggie burgers and sort of food tech has, where food tech and veggie burgers have collided, have sort of legitimized veggie burgers in a way that they weren't before. And so, these crazy valuations of these companies and this sort of the expectation of these products. I'm talking about like Impossible Burgers or Beyond Meat, and sort of the promise and expectation of these products. I feel like it sort of went up and now it's kind of come back down, and people are now looking more fondly on real veggie burgers. And I think Matthew saw that coming to some extent. And I've certainly I kind of agree with that reading. And so I think he just thought that there was an opportunity to give it new life. And, when we did the original one, this is my first cookbook. I'd never been involved in a photo shoot before. I'm kind of even embarrassed to tell the two of you this, but I didn't even know how to find a food photographer. I don't know if you have seen the first edition, but
I wouldn't know. Yeah, I wouldn't have known either. Yeah.
Well, so for the first edition, I mean, it was also a very small advance and very small, very, very small photo budget. But I knew that I couldn't shoot it in my little teeny apartment kitchen. And so I was like, I'm going to go down to my dad's house in Charlotte where I can use the kitchen. How am I going to find a photographer? I'll find somebody on Craigslist. I found somebody.
Wow.
And it was
amazing.
She and I shot the entire cookbook over one weekend. And I think to this day, it was the most exhausting thing I've ever done in my entire life.
Yeah.
And so this time it got a proper photo shoot with wonderful Evie Abler. I'm sorry, I feel like I might be mispronouncing her last name, but she's a super established, talented food photographer. And it got the proper photo treatment this time around too, and in a hardcover format, which before it was like a trade paperback original, which I think those have kind of gone out of style in terms of cookbooks now, because maybe it's gotten cheaper to do hardcovers than it was originally. But yeah, so it was reissued in a new hardcover edition, beautiful new photos that were it didn't shave off years of my life as the original photo shoot did. And
you didn't have to find the photographer
on Craigslist or otherwise.
Well, and I wonder how much some of that too. It's a combination of a young publishing imprint and a new author, because by now the experiment has probably worked with more photographers and done more food books too. They've got quite a few cookbooks on their list too. So you're both learning. And I noticed also in the new edition, it's the subtitle is Fresh, Flavorful, and Healthy Plant-Based Burgers, whereas the original was Fresh, Flavorful, and Healthy Vegan and Vegetarian. So that change in itself, to me, is reflective of what you were just talking about, Lucas, the change in the context and the the greater acceptance. I think in the introduction, you say in the first book, you felt like veggie burgers had something to prove.
Yeah.
There was this sort of antagonism around them.
Yeah, and the plant-based was a little bit of that was a discussion point too, which kind of interesting that even the language around all this has changed. At the time, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there's a little bit of contention around the phrase plant-based. For a lot of people believe that it means only it's vegan, whereas I feel like it kind of came about as an antidote to like highly processed vegan foods, and so it's like plant-based by putting like plants back in the center. But yeah, anyway, it's certainly a marker of how the conversation has changed.
When it comes to a second edition, I look back at like a first draft of something I've written maybe 10, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. It would be really interesting, but I'd also have moments of like, oh gosh, I would never do that now, or I would never write it that way, or I know so much more. So what was it like to just revisit a work that had been out in the world that you're now refreshing? I mean, was there times where you went, oh my gosh, or were there other times where you were pleasantly surprised? You're like, oh, I actually knew more than I thought at this time, and how to like put together a recipe, write a head note, all that. Tell us a little bit what that psychological sort of challenge was like.
Yeah, it definitely was a psychological challenge. I'm somebody who like, I feel like people who haven't written cookbooks might not be, you think that you hit this major milestone by just delivering the manuscript, not realizing that between then and when the book actually goes to print, you're going to have to reread everything many, many, many times and rewrite and just revisit. And then by the end of that process, I'm just like, I never want to see this again. And then there's also this fear that you're going to open it up and it's printed and you're going to find something and you'll be like, how did I miss that before? And so anyway, I usually, almost anything that I publish, I approach trepidatiously. And so with this, I sort of was like, okay, get ready. This is, you've learned a lot in this time. Wasn't sure if like my philosophy about cooking would have changed a lot. If like I sort of cast some ingredients, I wasn't even sure exactly how much was going to like sort of cause me anguish as I was revisiting it. But I was actually quite surprised. And I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but it's like, I always think like there's these tips I have about like drying fresh herbs so as to not waste them. And I forget that like, in every single book I like suggest how to like dry herbs, fresh, leftover fresh parsley, as if I've never told people to do this before. Like I forget that this is like one of the tips that I keep coming back to over and over again. And so I was realizing like, a lot of my thinking about food hasn't changed all that much. And there's some things in there I'm like, wow, you wrote that? That was pretty good. And so, it was an interesting experience too, where I don't think there are any hard and fast rules about, when you do a new edition, it's like, I could just rewrite the entire thing, and if I had all the time in the world and all the resources, probably that would be my first choice, just to like, let's just do this all over and sort of incorporate everything, where I am right now. But then part of me was like, well, I have to honor this in its original format. And, I hear from people all the time that, they have favorite recipes. And so it's sort of been validated in these credible ways. I went through and added new recipes. I included the recipes from my business made by Lukas, which I hadn't published those before. I threw in a couple other recipes. And then I did sort of some light tweaking, like, there's one ingredient that I liked a lot at the time, which was potato starch, which sort of helps as a binder in the veggie burgers. And now I prefer like arrowroot. And so I was just sort of expanding the options there, or cornstarch. And I changed my preferred veggie burger cooking method, which at the time of the book, I really thought it was best to sear them on the stovetop and then finish cooking them in the oven because, get that nice crispy exterior and then it'll properly like cook all the way through in the oven. And since then I thought, I feel like that's a lot to ask of people to like have to use their stovetop and turn on their oven and it's just a veggie burger. It's like, I'm just going to do like a long, extensive sort of cooking primer in the front matter, which we'll reference in the recipes. But otherwise just like cook them on the stovetop, until they're firm to the touch. So I sort of tried to simplify those recipes in that way as well. Yeah, I didn't try to overhaul the entire thing.
Right. Yeah, I thought you handled that cooking method very nicely because I've found that when I look back at some of my work, it's like, especially my first early work, I was trying to prove something. So things were like, maybe overly complicated because I just felt like in order to make it like worth the page it was printed on or something. And now I've simplified the way I cook. And so I wonder how to get around that because those old methods are still good, but sometimes you just want a simpler method. So I love the way you cite the, I guess it's 2-step, the sear and the roast or the sear and the bake in the beginning, but then you say you can just cook it on the stovetop, so you haven't like canceled out. Cause like you say, you have fans. This is a question I really am interested in because you have people who still love the first edition.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to come out and say,
everything I said,
throw away the first edition. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Because you've learned so much. The landscape has changed. The available ingredients have changed. I mean, a lot has changed in the past 13 years certainly in the plant-based space. I did use air quotes there because but you wanted to, acknowledge the changes, but also, the first book still stands.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the other factor here is like, how do you justify? I mean, because I'm going to be asked to like ask people to go ahead and buy this new edition, even if they've already bought the second. So what's the new value here? And to be honest, I'm not sure. I didn't come down on like a firm answer there. I think the new recipes bring a lot of value. I think the new photos make it a much more beautiful book. The new format makes it a beautiful book. I think it's like been tightened up in ways that make it a better book. But I think that the original edition is also still great. If you like the original edition, that makes sense.
Right. And it seems to me that you do a second edition to find a larger audience for the book or a new audience for an existing title because the fans already have that book.
Yes.
But maybe there's a bunch of people who now, Molly's air quote, plant-based, like they're just interested in incorporating vegetables into their lives. And this is a great format for them to do it, especially if they're busy. They don't have the capacity to come up with all these creative ways to make vegetables the center of the plate. And this makes it easy for them. So I could see this finding a new audience. When it comes to changes from the first edition to the second edition, you said there's no like hard and fast rules, but I'm curious to know when you worked with the experiment or whomever your editor was on the project, did you have conversations of like, I'm going to add 20% more recipes or the photography is going to be 50% new and we're going to use some of the existing. How did that all come together?
Yeah, there were a couple conversations. I feel like I came with all your questions. I was like, what do you want me to do? Like, I have no idea what the expectation here, what the protocols are. And they're like, well, it's kind of like up to you. What do you want to do? And so we ended up landing on like a number of new recipes and then sort of otherwise like revised. It wasn't fixed to like a percentage. It was just essentially like delivery dates. They sent me, I think they output the original PDF into a Word document.
Oh, nice.
And then I just went through and edited all that. And I did a separate document for all the new matter. And the photos were, I mean, to be honest, at the time that they reached out to me, I was in the middle of finishing my last book and I was working full time in a different job. And I was like, look, I would really like to do this, but I don't have a whole lot of time to commit to it. So like with the photos, I can't really be involved in this. And so I went to the photo shoot for a day, but they really handled the photo shoot for me too. So that was quite lucky. But I kind of feel like I earned that after the original photo shoot.
I think so.
After the first one, right? What was the timeline from, I'm assuming there's no proposal when you're doing a revision and your editors come to you. So you agree to do it, you sign a contract. What was your timeline for turning in a book? It
was a pretty roomy timeline. I think it gave me about 6 months. And then I think it even got pushed back in their schedule as well. So it was, we first had this conversation, I believe, in 2020 or 2021. And then I sort of handed everything over. And then I think there might have been an internal like staff shift and things that slowed it down. But a much roomier, much easier schedule than what I've typically experienced.
And it's out in time for summer, which is, even though veggie burgers aren't, you do say how to grill them, but
I know that was smart. Yeah.
But no, it's a summer book. It should be out for
absolutely.
Summer.
Yeah. And the cover is beautiful. It's this beautiful stack of veggie burgers and you just see all the vegetables. Like you see your, the pickled red onion, you see the avocado, and it's just, it's fun. It's a fun cover. And I could see that just grabbing people's attention too. It's very summery. It's very fresh.
I agree. I love that cover.
I don't know much about how second editions work, but I'm assuming there's an advance and there's a budget that's, similar. I'm not asking you to tell us how much it was, but it works the same way. There's an advance.
Yes, And then in my case for this one, the photos weren't part of my contract, except that they were handled by the publisher. And so it had the same thing with like on signing, there was a half of the advance, and then on delivery was the other half. So in this case, it was split into two.
Right. And the design, you already mentioned it went to a hardcover, but I was also interested in the structure of the book, because your first book, the chapters are very, they're the types of burgers. There's bean and grain, there's vegetable, and then there's soy-based tofu tempeh. And then you've got your condiments and your sides. And rolls, too. We should say they've got a bunch of it, which now that I know about your baking background, that makes sense that those are in there, too. But is that the same structure that was in the first book?
Yes. Yeah, okay. Pretty much the same. Recipes changed, but I kept the structure intact, yes.
Did you cut any recipes?
I think I did cut one. I had this one that was like it actually sounds really gross now, but I was...
Well, that's why you cut it.
I was stuffing like a portobello burger with like a seaweed salad and a little like toasted sesame oil thing. Like, actually, I don't know, maybe it came out in a UK edition, and then when they were reviewing it, they were like, "We're just going to take this one out. Is that okay?" It's like, oh, okay.
No way.
Yeah.
Well, I think anybody who's written a book that's been around for, a decade or more could probably go back and say, yeah, I might not have put that recipe in.
Absolutely. Well, I'm wondering too, just with your first book, I mean, it had to have seen a level of continued success for the experiment to even come back to you and say, would you like to do a second edition? So, I mean, is this book been the one that people have referred to the most? Because you've done so much more since then. Where does this book kind of fit in just your repertoire?
It doesn't have the highest sales, but it does have this most steady sales. And it was a very small advance, but it's the only book that I've received royalties for over the, for the entire period, which I now realize is like a pretty big deal. And it's always been really nice to get those checks in the mail. One thing that I am kind of amused by now is that I just never expected that this is going to like pin me as a veggie burger guy. It sounds so silly, but it's like, I think it was because of my having worked in book publishing and just knowing like this volume of books. It's like, they come and go, and so many of them are so good, and they just don't sort of get the traction. And I remember even doing press when the book originally came out. I was like, oh, wait, you think I'm an expert on this? I was like, what? And which, I mean, it sounds awful now and then I, remind myself that I certainly have like put in the time and developed all these recipes and done all this research. And yes, I know a lot about veggie burgers, but somehow it didn't occur to me that this would be like a subject that I would be perceived as having all this authority on. And now I'm like so grateful for that, because it's like given me so many incredible opportunities, and I've sort of better figured out how to own that, and also understand that you can sort of be an authority on something and still like continue to learn about it a lot, and that there are tons of authorities out there on all sorts of subjects, and it's not like absolute, which I think at the time I was like sort of freaked out by the idea of being seen as this like absolute authority. And
yeah, that's actually a really good point, because it's true. You spend all this time on a book, but you're working on this book in sort of your own little silo, and then it's out in the world, and all of a sudden this title becomes like, this is, Lucas's, he's the veggie burger expert. And you're thinking, but I'm a whole person. I do all these other things too. I mean, Molly, did you feel that way too with like all about...
I can relate, Lucas. I feel that many times I've been referred to as, the braising queen or the meat maven. I'm like, oh my God. Like, yeah, I wrote a book on braising and I'm really proud of it. And yeah, I mean, yeah, but I do other things, and it's just funny. There's something you said in the preface that just resonated, and it's a printed book assumes that it's possible to fully master something and to say that all there is to say about a topic. And it's such a great line. And we talk about this a bunch on the podcast about how, like, when you write something as an author, you have this authority. And so now you've written 2 veggie books. So you are, my goodness, you're the prince of veggie burgers. I mean, it's like it knows everything. You need to know anything about a veggie burger, Lucas is the person to go to. But I don't know where this conversation goes, because obviously you've done so much research on it and you've put your name to the book and that, but like you're saying, Kate, we're more than just the books.
And even the idea that like I have all this experience baking and I have opinions about chocolate chip cookies and opinions about like these other things, which like, not that I'm seeking solicitations to like, offer my opinions, but it's like, I actually, the reason I was able to write about veggie burgers is that I know about food broadly. It's not just one realm. Anyway, that's a dumb. I don't take that out of context. But
right. In terms of your experience in publishing in general, I mean, how did that sort of influence not only this book and this, the second edition, but just your other work too? Like, what did you learn about publishing that you think might have had you approach writing cookbooks maybe differently than somebody who was coming to cookbooks from, say, a non-publishing background?
Oh, yeah, so much when I really think about it. One key thing we touched on earlier is just like understanding the volume of books that get published and like what it takes to sort of capture an editor's attention. Yeah, when I help people with proposals, that's really what I'm trying to drill in. And I know you guys have talked about this a lot too, but like being able to succinctly explain in a very educated, informed way, understanding the market, knowing what your competition is, like what the thing is that you're doing, what makes it special, I think is so important. I also feel like cookbooks, and one of the reasons I'm drawn to them is like I'm a little bit like more, is it right brain, the sort of like math side, and left brain is the more creative side?
It's either one or the other. I get them mixed up.
Okay, well, I like enjoy project management, and there's something like very satisfying to me about like Excel spreadsheets and like being organized, and I think cookbooks in a sense are a lot about project management and being able to be super organized, and probably all books to some extent, and being good at that and being organized and understanding how to make your schedule, meet your deadlines. I mean, half of this work, especially in my smaller project freelance stuff, like half of my ability to sort of like get more work is just being really reliable and easy to work with, and like knowing, and sort of like to some degree, I'm not like too precious about it, if you know what I mean. That's like, I understand what my editors are dealing with. I understand what other people in the publishing house are dealing with. And I try to like sort of anticipate their needs. I think that might help me out a lot. And it like goes a long way to be like a good author and a nice author to work with.
That's so true.
Right. No, there's so many. I'm just resonating. So much is resonating. I often say when people ask for advice or help people out, it's like, get your work in on time. That's the first thing. Don't be difficult to work with, and then be competent. I mean, it helps if you're a good writer, but if you can't do the other two things, then the third one, you're not going to get a chance to do the third one.
Yeah.
And that whole project management thing, like a cookbook is you're building something, and it's like you have balance in it, and you have design, you have all these elements to it. It's so interesting. And then going back and revisiting a book you've already done too, all those skills, I could see, Lucas, how you would bring those to it. Because when you looked at your original, you looked at it as a whole, and then you start breaking it down in sections to see, did you retest all the recipes?
No, I didn't do all the recipes. Some of them I retested. But I didn't feel that I needed to do all of them. I was afraid if I started doing that, I'd just end up changing everything.
Understand.
Yeah.
One thing I wondered, too, is that since the book came out, there's probably ingredients that were harder to source or harder to get 13 years ago that now are pretty easy. I was thinking panko. Yeah. You can get panko everywhere now, but I don't know 13 years ago how prevalent it was.
No, so like panko, a Japanese style of breadcrumb that you can find in the ethnic aisle of your grocery store. It was like the whole disclaimer there. But
yeah. So were there any ingredients that you were thinking, oh, I can put more of this in the book, or I can just change the way I frame this ingredient because it's easier to find now? Or, you mentioned the potato starch, you finding different things that you liked better. Anything else that came up with the ingredients that you changed or modified? One
of the things that I introduced into the new edition, and based on this is having developed recipes for Made by Lucas, which sort of opened up. I don't know if you guys, with my veggie burger book and then with everything else, I sort of set a cast of ingredients, and or in my mind, it's like, I don't want to have to go beyond a Trader Joe's or whatever. Like I sort of set the scope. But when I did Made by Lucas, I was able to expand that because it was just such a different playing field. And one of the ingredients that I ended up using a lot was instant, dehydrated potato flakes, because
I saw that.
I wanted the store-bought burgers to be gluten-free and vegan, obviously. And I didn't think it just didn't even occur to me to even try playing with those when I was originally developing the recipes for the book. But then they became an ingredient in my store-bought burgers. And so I reintroduced those, or I introduced those as a new ingredient. And I kind of wish that it put some notes in there too about how you can, this is actually not necessarily the same thing as breadcrumbs, but it really helps to sort of absorb moisture, and it lends some body to the veggie burgers. And it's not like a flavor that washes away all the other flavors.
Right.
And I think that I mean, at the time, 10 years ago, there was still that like, the whole block of Bob's Red Mill products, in the grocery store. And I think that that's just expanded now. At least my grocery stores now, they're sort of like, there's the cereal one, there's the baking one, there's the beans and grains one. And so I feel like all this stuff is now pretty widely available. Even, Walmarts, across the country carry all these products. And so I didn't even feel like I had to suggest, include like sources for some of these types of ingredients. I think they've gotten like a lot easier.
That's true. Like I think with books nowadays, it used to be, especially I think like the big books that came out in like 2004, 2005, it was sort of a given that you would have a huge resources section in the back. And those resources sections seem to be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And now people think, I'm not going to have this because people can just Google it, which, fair, maybe some still, like you still need, some books still really need benefit from them. But for a lot of books that are more sort of, sometimes you just don't need that heavy lifting in the back to figure out, because people say, just Google it.
Yeah. I remember, I can't remember the book, but one had like the phone numbers where you would like, it was like a Lori Colwin. I think it was a Lori Colwin essay. Right. She's like, oh, call this number for, I think the golden syrup that you'd use like in a gingerbread cake or something. It's like, call this number, ask them for a catalog, they'll send it to you, and then you can send in a check and they'll send you the Lyle's golden syrup.
That's beautiful.
We've come a long way.
I made a mistake with phone numbers. When I worked on Cookie Love with Mindy Siegel, she had this source that she really liked getting specialty teas and salts and things from. And we put the guy's cell phone number in the book, and he kept getting calls, and it was just like, Mindy's like, that wasn't his business number I gave you. That was his cell phone number. It's like, oh, no. So anyway, I don't know if it's still in the book.
But I thought what you said about ingredient, I think, is a really good point about knowing your audience. And my sense from reading and writing is you have a pretty good sense of your audience and who you want to be for your audience. And that notion that you don't want to have to go beyond Trader Joe's. You're not asking people. You're trying to make it easy. You're trying to knock down those barriers of entry so people get into their kitchens. And I think that's something that carries across all your books, and something that I think for listeners to pay attention. Like when you're writing, if you're hoping to have, more than one book, that you're not changing it up. Like you don't have one book that's like a lot of really hard to find things or really, extensive techniques, and the next one's super simple. I mean, not that somebody couldn't pull that off, but I think it's a lot easier for people to know what to expect when they come to your books.
Yeah. Oh, I hope so. That has been something I've been pretty intentional about.
Yeah. And then what you said I thought about was so interesting about what you've learned from publishing. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but this was just about how many books there, and I think emerging new authors don't always understand how many proposals come across an editor's desk. And on the other end, how many books show up that the bookstores are looking at, and then how many titles the customers are looking at. And it's overwhelming. And how do you get, yours to stand out? That's the big question.
Yeah. I loved your episode recently with Matt of Kitchen Arts and Letters. There was so many insights in there.
It really was. So maybe if Portuguese baking is in your future,
with Trader Joe's,
we're going to make it happen. Right. Exactly. The Trader Joe's Portuguese baking book. I could see bestseller all over that. But with that publishing background, were you in nonfiction or fiction, or what side of publishing were you on?
All nonfiction. My first job was at the Feminist Press, which was a university press inside the City University of New York. And I was in academic marketing. And then I worked at St. Martin's, which is a big sort of very general trade. And I wasn't working closely on books at that point. I was still in the marketing department. But then worked in editorial at Thunder's Mouth Press, which is in sort of indie. It was part of Avalon Publishing Group, but sort of more independent publishing. And my last job in publishing was at a small boutique publisher called Atlas & Co., which their specialty was literary biographies. It was like Edmund White writing about Rimbaud, or Francine Duplessis Gray on Madame de Stael, or things like pairing like interesting writer with an interesting subject. And they were all commissioned titles. So I didn't really work on food books when I worked in book publishing.
So now it's like both worlds are kind of coming together, but that project management side is important in both aspects.
Yes.
So I think that's like because I'm also, just to go back to when you signed the book deal to do the second edition of Veggie Burgers, you said you were just finishing up a book, or you were about to come out with one of your books. So you were in a crunch time. Just take us back to that moment.
Yes. I was finishing Snacks for Dinner, which was my last book that came out in 2022. And then at the time my role was director of content. I was working with this cookware company called Misen here, which is based in Brooklyn. They make knives and cookware and things. And so that was a very full-time job. And the book was happening in nights and weekends. And I was just like, would love for this new edition to exist, but I really don't have a whole lot of spare time. But it all worked out.
Yeah. Wow. And that goes to being very good at project managing yourself.
I think so. I mean, I find a spreadsheet really satisfying, just like with the dates. I love the checkbox feature where you can just like put the little checkbox in a column. That's definitely,
yeah.
I need to have a snapshot of where I stand when I look at it.
Because you're still juggling. I mean, you have your Substack, Family Friend. Is the food journal Jerry still? Are you still?
No, we closed that down
alive?
In 2020. We did that from 2016 through 2020.
Okay. I just see that they're still available, but that's not a recent addition. I mean, I think Kitchen Arts and Letters still sells it. And
they might have some. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so my projects now, I've done some ghostwriting. I do a number of like freelance projects for, consulting things. And I'm working on another cookbook right now that I can't really talk about, but will eventually
Top secret.
share.
Will it have Easter eggs in it with veggie burgers?
I haven't figured that out yet.
Okay.
No, I always like to ask and the second edition, or with your background in publishing, it was really interesting how much you knew going into, but what sort of surprised you the most? Like, I'm going to do a second edition. Was there any like big surprise when you went back to redo it?
Trying to think if there was a big surprise. I really struggled in the beginning just wrapping my head around like what the sort of task was, if that makes sense, because
that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
I don't know if you guys are the same way, but it's like, when I'm working, I'm like taking notes and, pretty diligent about like really tracking my progress when developing a recipe. But when I'm just cooking, I'm just kind of like, and so like, I'm really like freewheeling in the kitchen. And I feel like that ends up becoming a very like generative time for me to like come up with new ideas. And so even if I were going to like test all the recipes, I could just test them and be like, okay, this works. But I knew that if I did that, what I would want to do is like, okay, this is good, but I want to use a different, I want to like change this up a little bit. And I think there's a better binder here, and maybe these flavors would be better. And I didn't know, I don't know, if I were to do that to its full extent, it would result in a completely different book in a way. It might still be veggie burgers, but it would be like a totally different.
And not necessarily better, just different.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was part of it too. It's like, because I'm quite critical of myself, it's like, this is going to be bad only because like it's so old and I've learned so much and stuff. But then I had to sort of, I get messages from people quite often that like they really, this helped them become a vegetarian, or these are their family's favorite recipes, or whatever it is. And they're like, okay, this isn't really up to me, and this is yours now. This isn't necessarily mine anymore. And like what I think about it is kind of secondary to the fact that it has found these other people who have strong feelings about it. So I needed to just kind of like, that helped me to like step back from it a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really well said.
That's great. And it helps them in their kitchen feeding themselves, which, as you said at the outset, is a lot your goal.
That's the goal,
so
yeah.
That's
I made the easy bean burgers over the weekend, and they worked perfectly. That was a perfect recipe that came together really well. And I had some cucumbers from the farmer's market, so I made your quick pickles, and they're in the fridge, and they're delicious. So I'm having fun with cooking through it, and I think this is such a great. I've struggled trying to create veggie burger recipes that somehow they just don't come together, and now I don't have to worry about creating my own. I can just use yours because I've got a lot to choose from here. So It's a beautiful book. Thank you for coming on to talk with us about it and tell us just about all the things that you do. We'll have links to the book and to your Substack and anything else you want in the show notes. And with that, I want to thank you, Lukas, for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Thank you, Mel. I've learned so much from this podcast, and it really is like one of the few that I listen to every single episode. So I really appreciate what you guys have created, and it's such an incredible resource for all of us in this space.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is also available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really does help other people find the show. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cirquitella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.